Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. This is Mint Startup Diaries. Our topic for today is at the heart of almost all newsroom discussions now. We've all heard of the Ashneer Grover fiasco, where there's a battle between the entrepreneur and the board. It ended with the vitriolic resignation letter he wrote to the shareholders. It was almost reminiscent of the whole fiasco with Housing CEO Rahul Yadav and its board, where he actually called the investors intellectually incapable. To be a founder of anything demands a certain set of qualities. Only a brave and confident person can take such a bold step, like building something on their own in the face of adversity and obstacles. Being laser focused, the ability to think critically, capitalist mindset, and being anti fragile. These qualities are often seen in founders. Initially, each founder succumbs to the culture of fake it until you make it, as we have come across many stories of revered entrepreneurs who are regarded as very difficult to work with. This conditions young founders to behave similarly in order to give in the same impression. Steve Jobs had a reputation of being curt and brusque with his fellow workers, and yet he's a role model for thinking differently, being the CEO of Apple. The people who take after him will not necessarily have his brilliant mindset or innovation, but they would certainly have the tendency to emulate him. They may not even realize that their behavior might be toxic. That's why it seems like they need someone to keep them grounded. And that's where boards and corporate governance come in. Coming back to the case of BharatPe, which became a unicorn in 3.5 years, Ashneer Grover started that the investor-founder relation in India is one of master and slave. He deems himself the rebel slave that must be hung by the tree, so none of the other slaves can dare to be like him ever again. These instances are somewhat emblematic of the disdain founders may have towards institutions required to keep founders realistic, and the overall culture may fetishize the idea of an infallible entrepreneur who doesn't need any governance. Yet, there needs to be board governance and oversight in order to hold management accountable to its shareholders and inculcate a culture, ethics, and values in a company. So, what really is the role of the board and corporate governance in a broader sense? How can strong governance be inculcated? How can there be a shared vision between founders and investors? To break it all down, please help me welcome Anjali Bansal, founder of Avaana Capital, Tarun Bhatia, managing director and head of South Asia in the forensic and investigation intelligence practice at Kroll, and Anchal Dhir, partner Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. It is my sheer pleasure and privilege to sort of welcome all of you, and all of us sort of know what is really transpiring at the BharatPe fiasco, but treating the conversation further from there. My first question to you, Anjali, really is that in 2022, what do you really think should be the founder's DNA?
Shrija, thank you very much for having me in this discussion, and I'm delighted to be here with Tarun and with Anchal. I think in 2022, founder's DNA is not particularly different. I have nothing but complete respect and awe for founders. I think it is the most brave, courageous thing that anyone can do. It's a lonely journey. Founders are people with tremendous vision, obviously tremendous risk taking, confidence, because without confidence they cannot take the risk and make things happen. They're also required increasingly, of course, in the startup ecosystem. Founders need to have a very strong understanding of technology. They need to be excellent people managers. They have to know how to raise capital. They have to know how to manage stakeholders. So really what we are requiring from our founders today is a lot more than even your average CEO needs to have. So it's a tough job being a founder, but at the same time, you're the most admired, most sort of sought after role models across the industry as well.
Thanks for that, Anjali. Tarun, I want to sort of get you in. And one important point mentioned by Anjali here was that the ability to manage all stakeholders. And she also mentioned that perhaps what we expect from a founder is more than you expect from your average CEO. In that regard, I want to understand, when we talk about the personalities of the founders, there seems to be this behavior that I'm God, this God syndrome sort of playing in. And we have seen this play out in few of the founders. And perhaps the playbook comes from the likes of Steve Jobs and others, where you feel that you can behave like some of those eccentric founders and you can get away with it. Do you think that narcissistic and toxic behavior is something which perhaps VCs also feed into? Because ultimately, at the behest of the great founder, his vision. What do you think about this?
Hi Shrija, good to be on a chat with you and sharing the stage with Anjali and Anchal. So I think firstly, I fully agree with what Anjali said. It takes a lot of courage, guts. Having been a professional now for close to 25 years and dealing with a lot of these founders, and we refer to new age money. It's not easy. So clearly, it's a very difficult role, and credit to the broader founder community, which has kind of developed very successful businesses in India. I think there are two or three things. You also referred to a culture. I mean, reference to Steve Jobs. I think first and foremost, and I would actually have some empathy for these relatively young companies and startups, because the challenge for us as a country is the more evolved institutions are not setting good example for us, be it listed companies, be it semi-regulator equivalent companies. I mean, we are seeing what's happening with NSE. So I think we cannot ignore the environment and the context in which business operates in India. And of course, startups have become very prominent. So I think that backdrop is very important, because they have seen how businesses are run, how big companies are run, and hence they are a small fish in the pond. So I think that is one. I think the second is my own experience in startups have been, because they are growing so fast. They're raising so much capital, especially tech enabled. They are not able to differentiate roles. And succession planning itself has become a challenge in startups so early on. I didn't anticipate that it would become a challenge so early, in their journey. But the companies are growing so fast. I think we have seen where people have been able to bring in the right type of professional, where the founder is really, the mind, the brain, or the heart, one of the two, and others kind of continue the operations. It's very important, and there are very good examples where founders have done that, where they realized very early on what is their core skills, and then there are other companies which struggle. So I think that is the second learning I have, that founders need to very quickly decide what operational role within the company they are going to play. They cannot be founders forever. They can become a shareholder. This founder terminology or promoter terminology is very Indian, and I think we need to get rid of that. And thirdly, again, my personal view is some of these companies and founders, their net worths, their valuation have grown so much. It's like how parents need to talk to their kids. I think that's where I feel the board needs to really mentor some of these promoters on, too much success too soon. And some of the examples you've referred, or BharatPe and others, I think some of these cultural issues are also playing out.
That's sort of very well said, Tarun. You began with the examples, perhaps in the public space, being not so great, and what we're sort of dealing with. And so there's a very interesting point about when does one ceases to be a founder? Perhaps shareholder is a better functioning. Why do we find it so difficult to let it go? And that is not the case only with startup founders. Even old school promoters find it so difficult to let it go, be it in case of private capital infusion or just giving up the management to outside CEOs. Anchal, I want to sort of like to sort of bring you in, and the same question from your perspective as a legal firm and somebody who is dealing with governance issues day in and day out. What really do you think should be the founder's DNA, especially in 2021? And I specifically ask this because we are 83 unicorns right now. We'll soon be 100 unicorns. And this flood of private capital doesn't seem to be ceasing anytime soon. So, what really is the founder's DNA for this decade?
Thanks, Rija. I think the way the discussion has been framed, I'm so glad to be on this discussion with Anjali and Tarun. This is absolutely the right direction to take this in, and I completely agree with Anjali when she described the founder's DNA, which is basically being at a very difficult place with very high expectations. And actually, it's the people, the founders who make it are really special in that sense. I think I would like to address this question, in a bit of a tangential manner, in a way to say that what is the DNA of the governance structure there? When you're looking at a founder's DNA is what it is, and how do we ensure that the DNA leads to actually optimal growth, right? And so what is sort of the DNA of the governance framework that should be there? And I think my initial thought on that is that completely agree with both Tarun and Anjali to say that we have to work around how founders are, right? And so the first thing to do then is not to look at the governance of a startup from the prism of a public listed company. I think once we adjust that prism, we will reach up, we probably there is another framework that applies, because actually, if you look at it, startups are a very difficult places, and they're constantly changing, right? From, where you see the entire angel stage to when you see the sort of mid stage and the late startup stage. They're very different, animals in that sense, early stage to a late stage. And the complexity is actually more public listed companies. You're looking at shareholders who don't have homogeneous interests, right, at all. Unlike a public listed space, the shareholder base is heterogeneous. You have multiple stakeholders in terms of the founder, and within founders, you have the active and the passive founders. You have some angel investors who come from a different perspective. You have VCs who come from a different perspective. And actually, the boards in startups are run according to contracts. They're not run according to principles of law in that sense. And unless we internalize that and sort of understand that that is how the engagement with founders has to be looked at, and the prism has to be different from the way we look at public listed companies. So, for example, the answer to governance issues in startups is not increasing independent directors, which is the answer in the public listed space. The principle in the public listed space, which is to say that there has to be proportionate the control has to be proportionate to the shareholding, would not work here in this sort of setup, because while the founder is fairly diluted in terms of running the business, it's only the founder who is running the business. So I think we face a lot of peculiar challenges, and I think this does entail a lot of sympathy and empathy for the founders. Of course, bad behavior, there has to be checks and balances to ensure bad behavior is curtailed. There is no value depleting behavior. But I think the answer really is in having bespoke governance structures for startups, and not sort of taking the frame of reference from public listed space, which I think seems a more obvious reaction to the governance issues that we've seen.
Yeah, thanks for sort of that, Anchal. But I think I would like to have a counter view on this. Because you spoke about the fact that there needs to be empathy and sympathy built in the founders. One could empathize and see the raw energy, but the fact of the matter really remains that I'm just talking about the BharatPe issue here, and I would sort of like to bring to light what the letter read. The Grover family and the relatives engaged in extensive misappropriation of company funds, including but not limited to creating fake vendors, through which they siphoned money away from the company's expense account and grossly abused company expense accounts in order to enrich themselves and fund their lavish lifestyles. The company reserves all rights to take further legal action against him and his family, it said, an indicator of a bitter legal fight ahead between the two sides as a result of his misdeeds. Mr. Grover is no longer an employee, a founder, or a director of the company, effectively showing him the door. So what we're saying is that there can be empathy and there could be sympathy for the founder, but nothing. You can't turn a blind eye to something like this. That's number one. That's where the board comes in.
Absolutely.
And secondly, and most importantly, to your point that the prism has to be shifted in terms of a startup when it's angel funded, Series B, Series C. But I would rather say that a great governance structure should be embedded in the DNA. Especially most of these companies increasingly want to go public. As long as you're private, you have this culture of fake it till you make it. But now, when you're going public, why should the handholding only start 6 months prior to the DRHP filing? And then all the dirt sort of comes out. Shouldn't it be the DNA of the company, what the governance is? Anjali, I wanted to bring you in the two aspects, the two questions here. The first is the corporate governance fiasco that you saw at BharatPe. What is your comment on that? What really was the board smoking to find this only now? Yeah.
So, Shrija, I could not comment on BharatPe. Do not know anything more than what actually all of you in the media report. So I think anything I say will probably not be new and be quite ill-informed. But let me take the other question that you mentioned. And the overall point, see, I think we are talking about, 88 unicorns and so on, right? We've had 8 unicorns in 2022 already. The pace of growth in these enterprises is so rapid. Companies are becoming large very quickly. So the traditional startup way was, startup will start, 4 or 5 years, it will continue to grow, and it eventually becomes big and goes public. Today, that cycle has got accelerated. So I'm not talking about poor governance. I'm just going to come back to governance, but specifically the maturity of enterprises that used to evolve over a period of time. When you went from being a small fledgling startup company, privately owned, to then raising external capital, then eventually going public, that gave sufficient time for the organization and the enterprise to grow from being a baby to a teenager to a young adult and an adult. Today, that cycle is dramatically accelerated. So a lot of things that you kind of take for granted in large companies, and Tarun made a very important point here, that let us not single out startups for governance or the lack thereof. We see enough bad behavior and very, very poor intentionality in some very venerable names, which have ceased to be venerable since then, right? So let's not there is a case in point here, which I cannot comment on. But overall, that's the role of the board. Investors and board members and so on. I find that just as there is 1 or 2 situations like this, there are all of the other startups are actually functioning with generally good intentionality, with fairly robust processes. And I say fairly robust, very good intention and fairly robust process, because process evolves. By the time they're ready to go public, most of them have appointed independent directors, high quality independent directors. They have audit committees. They've got big 4 auditors auditing them. They have internal audit in place. So again, I take intentionality or niyat is really at the core of governance. The niti or the rules are the framework for it. So let's talk. That's one thing about governance. Things move much faster. So sometimes it takes a bit of time for things to catch up. Poor intentionality, I don't think is limited to startups or to large companies or to promoter companies or professional companies. It can happen anywhere. And it is not acceptable in any of those cases.
I remember this comment made to me by a large private equity investor, a female private equity investor also, that Shrija, you can have as much governance on board, but you can't deal with the founder or promoter who has bad intentions. You can't do anything to deal with that. Tarun, I want to sort of get you in. Important point suggested by you that intentionality is perhaps as sort of screwed up in old age companies. So there's no difference between the old age or new age companies when it comes to what they're dealing with at the core, the ethics. Should the framework be different for both the companies, to what Anchal also pointed out in terms of the prism should be seen different? But just then to Anjali's point, the fact of the matter is that the prism difference argument could have been there perhaps 5 years prior. But now the time period from becoming a small company to a unicorn is accelerated just so much quickly. The company is becoming a unicorn in 2 years or 1.5 years. So shouldn't the governance and the governance structure processes be imbibed very early on?
So, maybe I have some mixed views here personally also, Shrija. And again, I think as a country, we are, whether we like it or not, we have done well, but we are still developing. So this obsession with unicorns or obsession with, valuations, and it's natural. I'm not critical of that, but I'm saying these do today, play a critical role across stakeholders, not just the founders, even investors, and so on. The other thing is, while I agree with Anchal that you cannot look at everyone with the same lens, because in your life cycle, in your journey, in your maturity, I think Anjali also referred to this. However, where I may slightly differ is, it's like, again, going back to raising kids in terms of value system. How much emphasis you put on which value could vary, depending on which life cycle. It could be influenced by the degree of processes or governance and so on. But that has to be a continuous process. I think that is where, and again, we have few bad examples, but we have very successful examples also. So it's not fair to paint the industry or startups in that lens. But at least in my experience, been in the risk industry for long enough, but as a core investigator also the last 6-7 years, uh, I think the key difference is, you understand somebody's niyat fairly quickly once you are a director, or you're part of that. You understand that. Then it's a trade off between how much you can live with and how much you can change. Because, sorry, to be fair to be founders, they are also in a new environment. So I have met many founders who are very open to feedback, if the feedback is coming, and they implement it. Uh, so I think, the power equation and how to maintain that becomes very important in these companies. But really, I think where companies have faltered, the younger companies, is this rapid growth, which again almost everybody is referring to. It takes your eyes away from some of these key issues. I mean, we have looked at cases where, there are whistleblowing allegations on acts of founders, and whether we like it or not, investors have ignored it. And that's a reality. So that's where I'm saying it's the trade-off. One could say that this is not serious enough, or I could live with that. And in parallel, we have also come across instances where, smallest of things, like hiring somebody who may not have been, the best person for that leadership role. I have seen investors take it up very seriously at board meetings. I mean, I've had the benefit of sitting as an observer in some of them. So I think, which is where I'll just keep coming. If you get to governance, role of boards, or other mentors for these startups, it's very early in their process. If they're educated, if they're informed, if they are told some of these things, I have seen very strong successes. But it is a continuous process. I mean, I think we make a lot of it from an IPO and so on. A lot of these companies, are so tech heavy that they have to have good processes to survive. So it's not
Yeah.
that they don't have. But I just feel some of these things are very ad hoc. So they also, suddenly a founder is told, you need to do things like this.
But tell me
Uh,
one thing, Tarun, what really transpired at BharatPe? Do you think that that could have been avoided? That investors could have been more vigilant? What does it mean for investors per se, the investors' fraternity? I mean, look at the kind of people at the top management. They're all related to each other, right? Your head of control, then your co-promoter, then the promoter. I mean, all of this just tells you something that perhaps it was worse than a related party transaction also, right? I mean,
so
couldn't the investors would have been a little more vigilant in that case? And what does it really mean for other investors who are partaking stakes in other unicorns? I'm sure the fraternity has been very silent for some reason.
So two things, Srija. See, again, I again am not directly involved with the matter, so what I know is also of what I've read. But two things. I mean, again, see, related party. What if the closest people were in key roles? That's not new to a startup culture. That's not uncommon. Actually, you want to do some of these businesses with people whom you trust and are comfortable with. It's very natural. So I wouldn't necessarily blame that aspect. I would, however, I mean, everything else remaining same, be surprised if this was the first time, if these issues are what they are, as have been highlighted, if this was the first time somebody came to know of. That I would be surprised, purely, from an investigative uh, conscience. Because, it's not a 0 and 100 sum game. So I think that aspect, maybe yes, investors need to take a deep look at what they missed or what they could have done.
Okay, so in terms of a governance board structure, and I wanted to bring you in actually, you mentioned that Shrija, the answer is not getting more independent directors on board. That is not the answer for startup. So, what is the correct governance structure of, say, when all the companies are these are all technology companies. I mean, there is nothing else now. The real estate is a real estate tech, education is ed tech, everything is technology. Technology is the center and everything is being built around it. Three parts: content, community, commerce. So I think the playbook for how unicorns are being built is sort of fairly becoming increasingly more and more clear. So you have this great guy who knows Web 3.0 technology very well, and there's an ecosystem built around it, right? So what is the governance structure? The governance board structure should look like to also tame this so-called founder who perhaps only knows technology and bring him and educate him or initiate him to this new world? What should the governance structures really look like?
Sure, Shrija. So see, anywhere, when you look at how governance is implemented, it's implemented by having the right principles and then having the right prescriptions, right? And in India specifically, we have a very prescription heavy regulation when it comes to public listed companies, and that is how sort of the governance happens in that space. Now, the only thing, the difference is that, like I was saying, that you can't sort of replicate that entire prescription into this space because of the complexity of the capital structure, the complexity of the interests, and the accelerated growth that Tarun was talking about. Actually, what we are trying to protect is that we don't want to take away the entire benefit of a startup, right, which is accelerated growth. And governance is a means to an end. And if your end is impacted by what procedures you are putting in place, then the governance has no meaning, right? And so here, the principles, of course, have to be put in place from the very beginning, right? And I mean, nowhere did I say that when you give empathy or sympathy to the founder, you dilute the principles of governance. They underscore how the company is run. But how do you prescribe for it and how you apply it? And do you apply it in a way that gives adequate flexibility to the founder to lead to continue the accelerated growth that is required, and which is why everyone is invested into the company to eventually reach a stage which is a list stage or an IPO stage, right? And what is it required, in my view, is actually a very is a bespoke answer. It's a very case specific answer. The reason is that in any case, all startups and with which are completely VC backed are anyways governed by shareholders agreements that the VCs have at the board level, right? The nomination rights, the board structure itself is negotiated. The rights are extensively negotiated. So what needs to be done is a negotiation which balances out what the founder needs to continue with the accelerated sort of growth and what the investors need and other stakeholders need to watch for bad behaviors, right? Now, if the guidance is taken from the public listed space, the impact that happens is that at the end of the day, even in public listed space, and you mentioned that there's a lot of commonality that you can draw, and the issue that public listed companies with promoters face the same here is actually gatekeepers' anxiety. That a lot of decision making in public listed space is slowed because you have the liability issues that are there, and sort of then a lot of responsibilities put on independent directors to take decisions. I don't think that kind of sort of slow decision making process can work in a startup space where literally, again, to Anjali's point, the growth is extremely fast. You don't see public listed companies growing at that pace, right? And so, again, not commenting on the specific issue that you raised, because I don't think any sort of any case, I mean, there is any place for fraudulent behavior, right? And you need to put checks and balances in place to ensure that that does not happen. But there are many things beneath it, right? To your question on, say, related party transactions, they're not prohibited. There need to be checks and balances to ensure that they're fair, right? So the issue, if, for example, the issue is related party transaction in these situations, what is needed is a more sensible way of ensuring that there is proper board oversight on those transactions, as opposed to putting them in a bucket to say that they should not be there, right? And so when you have a startup sort of a governance structure you're looking at, you will look at it within the framework of the rights that the investors have. I think the only shift that we need is a balancing that out to ensure that the value that is being created continues, but the value that is being diluted because of bad behaviors gets checked.
So I think that's the question, and that's why I began the conversation asking with what is the founder's DNA. If someone were to ask me that question, I would answer it that the ability to listen in the founder, that perhaps I find very missing. I know everything syndrome is increasingly is what I find in most investors that I talk with. Shrija, this is how the industry will be disrupted or defined 5 years from now. This is how this has to be. We know this. And this one is the knowledge and the experience, the skills that you bring to the table. And other is the ability to listen from all your stakeholders, be it the investor, your independent director, the board, and just ranting. Rants don't help is the question that I'm trying to make the larger point that this I know everything syndrome is something which perhaps can work very detrimental to the founders fraternity as we talk of the next decade. This entire question of, and Anjali, I want to ask you this, that when all of this happens, who do you think externally loses in the war between investors and founders? Are there scores of people who now want to perhaps leave an organization, which perhaps is doing its core functionality well, but because of all of this happening, the morale of employees it's abysmally low. People from all levels want to leave. So who do you think externally loses in the war between investors and founders?
Everybody loses in a war, Shrita. Whether it is a war between countries, between investors and founders, or when it happens in large companies also, you have hostile M&A. In the short term, everybody loses. So a war is never a good thing. And it's kind of an unsaid truism in the investment community that if you have to litigate, the game is half over anyways. Companies will recover, there's no question, if the business model is robust and there is true innovation there, companies will recover. But let us take a step back here. See, these situations actually hurt everybody. It hurts confidence in startups. It hurts investor confidence. It is sometimes a detractor for founders. They say, my God, this is too hard. And I don't want to take the risk and so on. But at the same time, let us not forget what makes founders founders, right? You started with founder DNA. What makes founders are very special people. Why can't all of us become founders? Because it takes a very unique individual to be a Steve Jobs. And unique individuals will have their angularities. Investors are investing behind the holistic person, not one aspect of a person. And what was going through the investors' minds when they made their investment decision is actually none of us can comment, right? Because it is very much a thought through, analytical, sometimes objective, sometimes subjective analytical decision that is taken at the time of investment, and then continued support for the company. It's also a question of, you said learning agility. I actually think the best founders are amazing learners. They have to be confident. So they will project confidence both publicly and privately, but it's the most confident people actually who are the best learners. Because they have no insecurity about saying, hey, this is something new. I don't understand it. I'm going to learn it. And they are smart people. As we know, they're quick. So they're quick to learn also. I know plenty of founders who have said, hey, I've got to learn governance really quickly. I've got to learn ESG really quickly. Because my company has grown. I'm being told by my investors. I'm being told by my board. Maybe planning for a listing, maybe not. But I can tell you hand on heart, the best founders are the most agile learners. They may present as confident, arrogant, call them whatever, but they are not short on learning. And beware as an investor, any founder who comes across as I know it all.
Yes.
But at the same time, that is where I think we probably expect a lot. And let us not make, just like we say in corporate India, right? Let's not make one bad actor a representative of. So we don't know who's the bad actor and whether there's a bad actor. All of those investigations are ongoing and so on, right? But still we have a vibrant industry. So let's continue to celebrate the spirit of the founders and the entrepreneurs and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Nobody's throwing the baby of the bathwater, and celebration and too much romanticism of startup fraternity is anyways happening.
Yes.
And I don't
But
think there's
I'm
any,
glad you're
and
putting this lens on.
I don't think there's any dearth on that. I think there's
Yeah.
too much of romanticism happening,
Yeah.
and that could actually be scary. Because when too much romanticism happens, and some of these companies are going public, and the idea of doing a discussion like this is to perhaps tell them that what the other side could also look like.
Can I ask a
Uh,
question? What is the purpose of enterprise? We've debated this many times. Is the purpose of a startup to become a unicorn in 3 years or to build a really solid, scalable, successful long-term business? So
I
once
don't
we
really
start
know.
defining those things, then, and similarly, it is, we look at the most valuable companies in the world today. The ones that are not existing today, we don't even know about because they crashed and burned. There are enough of them, the Enrons, etc. Were flying high, had perhaps didn't invest enough in their foundation. And good governance, good intentionality, good values, Tarun mentioned values, are fairly foundational to any enterprise. So
That
for
is that
longevity, you
is
need to have all of this.
that's a very valid point, that what really is the end purpose of the enterprise, and often that answer lies with the founder. Some of them, the ambition that Shrija will become a unicorn in 3 years. Before you even ask what the startup is all about, this will become a unicorn in 3 years or 2 years, because that is the mindset. So you can clearly become, as people who speak to these to the founders, we also get instincts. We also get intuitive about who is thinking in what direction, and you understand who is building to last and who is trying to start up a company to perhaps achieve a milestone. And I don't think personally there's anything wrong in both the approaches either. Uh, to you answered that question, that Shrija, everybody loses in a war. So to that, my follow-on question really becomes, and then how can founders balance the tightrope of transparency versus confidentiality, especially in a world where you are privately owned and you have to do this? So perhaps, Tarun, what would your response to this really be? How can founders balance this tightrope of transparency versus confidentiality?
Sure. So I'll answer that, but just 1 minute before that, Srija, I also feel, of course, now we have so many startups and startup culture is really booming. But honestly, and picking up from what Anjali said, these founders don't know when they start what's going to become. They have an idea. They have a strong, I mean, they're technically strong in some part of that idea, and of course they grow into that. And if you raise your first capital, your confidence grows, the next round comes, your valuation grows. But I mean, I think you're right, there is an ego that founders have. I think they need that ego to also sustain and survive in this environment, because we are talking about whether it's BharatPe or something else which have faltered after becoming so big. There are many others whom we are not talking to. Many of them could have had right intentions and so on. So it's a difficult journey, but I think none of them know what's gonna happen. So they are all, taking a belief, a shot at what they think they have in their mind, and then hoping that things work out. I think with respect to transparency and confidentiality, two things I always joke, because when we are also as investigators brought in after the accident is done, and it's more like a post-mortem. But if you were to look at these startups, and I would say go through their board minutes for the last 5 years, first 5 years of their journey, what gets discussed there, independent director or not, really defines the culture, really defines how much is the focus on governance and process. Because majority of the discussion will of course be on business, right? You're dealing with a fire every other day. Capital raising is your focus, business scale up is the focus, but still how much time does go into some of the other things? I think that's where the DNA of a well governed company to a good or a profit making company, that's the difference. The second is, you referred to Steve Jobs initially. I mean, I think who would have thought that Steve Jobs would get credit for selecting the best successor? I mean, who had heard of Tim Cook?
That's so true.
you know
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
really, for all his genius and innovation and designing, he really knew what will be the next step for Apple, and he picked that guy. To me, that's his genius. Beyond everything else that gets discussed of Apple, of course, I mean that it was a long life cycle, but I think founders who can start thinking like that after their company has achieved a unicorn status or has grown to a level where they start thinking, okay, this is where I'm really good at this. Can I find somebody else in family, outside family, professionals? I think that's where I see a gap today. And I feel maybe that's where a board can be much more involved, and not all members of the board need to be equally involved. I think, see, my experience is founders also look up to somebody in the board. They don't look up to all six
Oh,
people.
yeah. That's true.
So if you can establish that relationship and that guidance, I think that can play a big role. And I think those are the differences.
So let's
Can we
ask
say
a very,
something?
let's ask a revered board member, Anjali, who is across board of large companies and startups, and she should definitely answer this question. First of all, you are a revered board member. I know that, Anjali. They are founders, and I've spoken to them who have fondness for you. You have managed to develop that, and you're also asking some tough questions on the boards of some large companies. So my question to you really is that what are the kind of key performance indicators that should be set and reviewed at meetings between founders and the board? Some key performance indicators, like the tough question, which should really set the ball in the correct direction. What should those really be? But you were saying something. Yeah, please
No,
continue.
actually, along those lines, I was just reflecting on how we are talking about the role of the board. And in the large company, listed company world, we are saying the board needs to now expand beyond compliance and oversight and really go into strategy and ESG and future readiness. Maybe on the startup side, we have to do the opposite. Most boards today, because they're shareholder
said.
boards, and Anchal said it so well, right? The purpose of a startup is to create value. That's why there are investors. So you cannot get in the way of that. But maybe for startup boards, the focus is generally around business plans. The KPIs are all around growth and profitability and next fundraise and so on. Maybe that role needs to now expand. And even shareholder directors need to become conscious of some oversight, compliance, role of governance and that of the board, not just because it's a good thing to do, but because there is enterprise risk. You see, the law of the land does not differentiate between a startup or a big company. If there is malfeasance, everyone gets treated the same way. So the enterprise risk inherent if there are compliances lapses or intentionality lapses and the board doesn't catch it in time is very significant. It's very value destroying. So just like in the big companies, we are saying the board needs to actually look at strategy and future readiness. In the startup world, maybe the board needs to also think about compliance and governance because there is enterprise risk.
That is very true and very well said. So, Anjali, you think there should also be penalties for board members then, who perhaps did not act in a more prudent fashion or did not do their job well? What about that? Why should the onus only be perhaps on the founder itself? Yeah. Shouldn't the board also be?
Yeah.
Because a large companies and large amounts of money we're talking about ultimately.
No, but there are very significant penalties for board members of listed companies where there is external public capital. When it comes to private capital, it's a different set of imperatives. First of all, in some ways, board members are protecting not just rights of the shareholder, because there aren't this multitude of heterogeneous shareholders that Anchal earlier referred to quite well. Each shareholder represents their interest. So just the recognition that in the enlightened self-interest of the capital provider or the investor, enterprise continuity and enterprise success is actually in the enlightened self-interest. So I wouldn't know how to create penalties around that because I think there is adequate positive incentive, and I'm sure there are negative consequences when there are lapses like this because the funds don't make the returns.
Yeah, so there should be, but we haven't really seen any such case like that. There's nothing structured in that fashion, and perhaps it should be.
But the
right?
law does not, right? The law actually, and Anchal, you should comment on this. The law is much more stringent when it comes to public retail, particularly retail or institutional, but public money. Here, this is a set of private institutions making negotiated arrangements and negotiated contracts. So if things don't work out, I don't know how much of that is actually in the purview of the law or whatever regulator there might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's driven by who the stakeholders are, and the stakeholders in sort of a public space are, not just the public shareholders. You'll also have sort of, the funding in public listed companies will be by public sector banks, who again is public money, right? Whereas when you come into the startup space, it's primarily private money. So in that sense, I don't think that the liability is a driver, for why, governance has to be at the forefront, as much as it's actually for value creation and value preservation, right?
But I
And
think that should be there now. I would say so. Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that, I have a different view on liability. I think when liability is the driver, I think it sort of leads to not appropriate decision making, right? Because at the end of the day, boards are difficult places where you have to take that balanced decision. If you're constantly driven by a fear of liability, maybe you're just holding back the growth of the company. And we understand that attitude, that perception when a director of a public listed company. But when it comes to a startup board, absolutely. See, if they've not done their duties, very obviously, I don't think there is a way out of any liability. In fact, just under law, there is a very clear liability under Companies Act. So, of course, there is SEBI liability for listed companies, but they adequately, provisioned under the Companies Act itself that cover liability of directors if they've not performed their duties. And of course, the Companies Act differentiates between non-executive director and executive. The founder, please note, will be an executive director, right? So it's sort of differentiation in that liability. And that is why I don't think that in the startup space, the driver for the boards to do their job should be the fact that, there is a sword hanging on your head. It actually should be that, it's a question of value creation. Everyone's interests are aligned.
No, I know, I understand the value creation bit, but I also feel that the boards play a very important role in the life of a startup. Talk about, for instance, this entire attitude towards cash burn and companies having huge cash burn. Ultimately, it's a board sanctioned strategy. It's a private company, and you can't even question the financials because the promoters get away with saying, we're a private company, Shrija. We are attaining a GMV of X billion dollars by 2025, whatever that means, right? So ultimately, all these conversations and all of this goes under the garb of value creation, accelerated growth. It is a startup. So what I'm trying to say, perhaps the playbook needs to change a little, because the acceleration of India's startup ecosystem has been tremendous. I have not seen this in the last 10 years. This is unprecedented, what I'm seeing right now, honestly. And I just feel that floodgates of capital have not even come now with this entire ESG and Web 3.0 and this metaverse narrative being built in. We are in for a very large haul here. But I think it's taking the question sort of further. For my own understanding, and it's a very great conversation, I want to understand something, that if I have founded a company, can I cease to be a founder? Because just talking about this BharatPe issue, it said that Ashneer is no longer the employee, the founder or director. How can I cease to be the founder of a company? How does that work?
So why don't I give a very legal answer, and then I think we can also go into how it's perceived. So firstly, there is no legal status to the position of a founder, right? It's actually either a promoter or a sort of an employee or a shareholder. And, so in that sense, founder does not have a legal sort of meaning to it, but definitely it is something that has extreme relevance sort of from a positioning of the company standpoint. And, this is something which is also used when you look at IPO documents of various sort of, earlier startups who have listed. They very clearly brand certain people as founders, right? So it is something that is very close to the heart of the founders to be called founders. And so in that sense, it is a significant action taken by a company against someone to just, take away that title from them, because the positioning the company in that instance would be that the company would not no longer claim them to be the founders of that company, right?
So I think it's the harshest action you can take against anyone. You're firing the founder from the company, right?
From just the positioning perspective, it will still be seen as a harsh sort of an action. But not something which has a lot of, but in this day and age, I think one is the prescription, and there are many other things that lead to sort of what it means to be it's a social standing kind of a thing, right? And so when the company does an IPO, he will not be named as a founder, and that probably is something that is of an issue. But your question on whether you can cease to be a founder, I mean, like I said, there isn't this concept, but of course there is a very clear concept of when someone is a promoter and not a promoter. So as you go down the life of a company, there is very clear connotation of when you cease to be a promoter of a company, but that doesn't apply in this instance.
Yeah, Tarun, you want to make a quick point on this
No,
one?
no.
Yes.
So I mean, more on the lighter side. In this case, it's clearly more messaging. I remember, in
Yeah.
Hindi movies, when you court martial somebody from army for not doing the right thing, or they strip off your, badges and all. This is akin to that, because
Exactly like that. Yeah, absolutely.
this is basically the company saying we don't recognize you as, someone who's associated in any form. The person can still claim to be the founder or whatever. So I think it's more, I would say a dramatic version of, the seriousness being attached to it more than
Yeah,
anything.
stripping one's identity completely off, essentially. The last question, really, what is the degree of intervention you think boards ought to have in companies? Is it more laissez-faire, or should it be more hands-on, or should it vary from company to company? What is the balance between rigidity and flexibility to be made? I can start with you, Anjali, and then go on to others. Yes.
Agility, flexibility, I think is a given in startup and for a founder. Often startup boards also have to develop and exhibit those characteristics and continuously learn and keep up really with the founders. So I'll go back to where I started. I'm in awe of founders, a big admirer of the community. Lots to learn, and I think that some of the best people in some of the biggest problems in India are going to get solved through our innovation ecosystem. And some of the best people are our founders, really. We will have exceptions, but that cannot sort of paint everyone with the same thing.
Yes, and we are definitely not painting it with the same brush. This is a point in case when we are sort of discussing that. Yes, Tarun, what about you?
Yeah. So see, I also, I believe in the whole spirit of entrepreneurship, especially not being one. Extreme respect for, what they do. But I would just say, it's like having the board. And again, I definitely don't want it to become too prescriptive, because my experience, having spent time in rating agencies and all, whenever something becomes too prescriptive, I think that's not a good thing. But, I would say if boards were to play a role of being a difficult neighbor, if you do anything which is not, in line, or not really, or interferes with others, then somebody to come and, start poking you, rather than getting involved in every day-to-day action, because we really want them to be free spirited, right? We want these entrepreneurs to do what they want to do, but let them know that I'm watching. I think what has happened, and I'm also going back to my original principle, I just feel whether it's a large company, old company, promoter led company, professional company, our biggest problem is one person becomes too powerful than the board,
True.
powerful than other employees, than other shareholder. I think that's the start of the problem, and I would say being a bit more vigilant on that is really important in startups without cutting their wings.
That's so well said. What about you, Anchal? Yes.
Can I just underscore?
Sure,
I completely agree with Tarun. I think the whether it is a startup or a big company, when individuals overtake the organization and the institution, that's when some problems may arise. And boards in both situations need to stay vigilant, whether they are shareholder boards, internal boards, or external and independent boards. They have to stay vigilant, not just around sort of growth and numbers of the company and business results, but also creating and making sure that the right foundation is getting built. And compliance and oversight and internal audit are all extremely boring for startups. But those are the things that can create massive enterprise risk.
Okay, that's well said. What about you, Anchal? Any last comments? Yeah.
Completely agree with Anjali on that. In fact, when we sort of stress upon how every member of the board should understand that only everyone has one vote. Just because you have 10% or 20% shareholding outside, but when you enter the boardroom, everyone comes with one vote. So we use this sort of a cartoon in which we have one person very huge on the table and the others really small, and we say you need to balance it out. Everyone has to look the same. And that's very important, because I think that leads to balanced decision making, right? That leads to every stakeholder interest being looked at. And if boards are diligent in every decision making, take into consideration everything, and at the end of the day, it's these are simple things, but when you actually have to apply it on a day-to-day basis, it becomes challenging, and boards do become very difficult places. So one is, of course, as Tarun and Anjali said, it's just doing the job very seriously and very well, and everything being a very considered and sort of considered a decision, and something where you're not blindly relying on someone, right? So you actually satisfy yourself that what is being considered is something that you've thought through. The other is, in terms of just the engagement with the management, is active oversight, right? So it has to be an active, engaged oversight, and also putting in the processes. A board can't run a company, they can't run it, right? So they have to have processes in place that actually lead to them being assured that the things are working properly, and having proper escalation mechanisms. Because one other challenge that we face is that sometimes management say we don't know what to escalate, and board is like, well, this didn't come to me, right? So proper escalation mechanisms and proper delegations, like managements are also clear what needs to be escalated to the board and what not.
Okay,
I
great.
think these.
Great. I think it's time for rapid fire, and I can't let you all go with that. It's such an interesting and what a lovely conversation. I just didn't want to end this. And I'm sure all of our viewers and watchers will be copiously taking down notes and understanding as to what important point we're discussing here. So I'll begin with you, Anjali. What is your response to this comment made? And this is for the investors fraternity, which is I ask you. I am now looking up to people like Churakias and Kamath, who have the courage to build businesses with 100% ownership. It will take a bit longer to build. I will be in control of what I build and not build it for these people who are opportunistic. How would you respond to this attack on the investor fraternity?
I think it's a very legitimate comment, and everybody has a choice on how they want to build business, whether they want to build it with their own funds and take longer to build it, and that's a very legitimate choice, or they want to grow faster, so they have to raise external capital. Just as it is a choice whether you want to stay private or you want to go public. These are all choices, and I actually have no reaction, because yes, it's true. You can decide who you want to build for, and actually having the right investors who are great partners for you can be very value additive. Not having the right investors can be value destructive. Similarly, as an investor, if you don't have the right founder, it can be very damaging in many, many ways, not just financially. So yeah, it's absolutely legitimate choices, but it's I would rather it not be us versus them, because it is a partnership journey.
Okay. Tarun, if you were to be the advisor to Ashneer Grover now, what would you be advising him? The first thing, what would you be telling him? Be it on anything, his media communication strategy, what he speaks, what he thinks, what would that really be?
Go on a vacation. Right now, yes. I mean, I think no one is coming better off in this one, right? As a bystander, as somebody who's reading. I mean, it's playing out like a sitcom. Because you can't take sides. You don't know the complete truth. And there is value destruction. I mean, I fear for the employees who've put in so much, So I don't think anybody comes off better. I'm sure everybody's fighting for their rights. So again, I'm not in a position to say who's right or who's wrong. But I genuinely hope that, the resolution of this is in the right spirit. Because, what happens is, whether we like it or not, these become examples. And the last thing you want in an environment that we are in is to kill an entrepreneurial spirit. That's really is not the agenda. And at the same time, you also don't want people to think there is easy money and I can do whatever I want because I'm the founder. So I think there are mature investors. There are a lot of senior people here. I just hope it finds the right resolution process rather than getting messy.
I think Anjali is all ears for Ashneer. And that brings me to my next question, Anchal. Revenge entrepreneurship. What do you think is the path for that? Founders who are disgruntled, perhaps want to show something or prove something to anybody. What really is the end game for some of those ventures? Do they really pan out the way one envisages them to be?
Well, one would love that they pan out. I think eventually everyone benefits from a successful venture. And we hope, like that they pan out well and they sort of build large enterprises. The thing is, I don't think there is one path to successful ventures and successful enterprises. I think if we just take the sort of guidance from US, I think the trends now come by a plane and not on a ship. So I think we're seeing what is happening in India far quickly, that happened in the US. So I think there are multiple ways of reaching of sort of entrepreneurship and of creating large corporations. So which I won't sort of brand it as revenge entrepreneurship. I think eventually it's about just proving how good you are. And I think one is, of course, whatever said and done, governance will only add value to your journey. It's not going to take it away from it. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anjali, Tarun, and Anchal, for really sharing those meaningful insights with us. Till time I see you next, goodbye and good luck. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shrija.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.